times you're in a situation that can't be defended. Again, it was very clear. Even when we go back to that 2002 party where Donald Trump and Epstein were having a party by themselves with all of those calendar girls. The guy that was bringing the calendar girls down, and I put that in quotation marks, said to Trump, warned him of his reputation with underage girls, said he wanted no part of it. Trump himself in 2002 told New Yorker magazine that Epstein liked young girls. Everybody knew this. Acosta by 2007 had 30 young minors coming forward saying that they had been raped or sexually abused or sexually harassed by Jeffrey Epstein. And he still put forward a deal that would shield Epstein forever from prosecution. I don't think he can defend that in a press conference.
And he tried yesterday, right? That was Secretary Acosta's best defense. That was the best performance he could possibly give. And it wasn't very convincing, and for all the reasons we've just laid out. President Trump, as we know, has no particular affection for Alexander Acosta. He's not a loyalist, not a guy who's been by his side for a long time. I think if President Trump finds him disposable, he will dispose of him pretty quickly. And frankly, as we all know, anybody who's not inside the family at this point is disposable. So I wouldn't expect Acosta to last if this continues to heat up. I wanted to ask Elliot just to pull back the aperture a little bit here and look at the big picture of what's going on. Given your experience as a prosecutor, given everything you know about the legal system and some of the pressures that might be put on from the outside by powerful people, what do you think happened here? Why would Alexander Acosta, a guy who had a good record previous to this, he's a well-pedigreed attorney and everything else, why would he enter into this non-prosecution agreement? Why would he ignore a 53-page indictment and more than 30 victims in this case? What do you see going on here, Elliot?
Look, we all read the Miami Herald piece that laid this out beautifully, that said that you had an incredibly influential defendant with incredibly high-powered attorneys who was beat a case. That's what it came down to. Look, there were, as Joe said, dozens and dozens of victims here. Right. And, if they wanted to bring a case, they could have figured out a way to make it. And now, as we know, everything that's charged in New York, that was charged in New York earlier this week, could have been charged back then because it was all largely the same conduct. And there would have been a nexus between Florida and New York if they just had taken the time to look for it or been able to find it. And so, no, it's a wealthy defendant with a lot of money that might have caused a lot of heartburn to a to a federal prosecutor's office down there. And I think they might have just gotten spooked.
What does that mean, to cause heartburn? In other words, if your job is to protect the victims and to prosecute a case, what does money do to a prosecutor?
Sure. So, for instance, they could have embarrassed the victims. They could have embarrassed the prosecutor. I mean, this happens all the time. People lodge their defenses, and they're entitled to do so. But when you've got a lot of high-powered attorneys and a lot of money, you can, cause a higher profile problem for a federal prosecutor's office. And I think they might have just gotten scared. And again, Julie Brown's Miami Herald piece really lays this out, talking about, and frankly, the interplay between how the prosecutors and the defense attorneys were talking to each other. There's a quote from one of the articles that one of the line prosecutors was scouring the federal code for misdemeanors she could charge because she wanted it to go away and didn't want to charge him with a felony. They were just trying to avoid, it appears, that they were just trying to avoid publicity. They were trying to avoid drama, for lack of a better term, for the prosecutor's office. But you're exactly right, Willie. Your job is to protect the public. And again, thankfully, the Southern District of New York has taken that addition. It took a decade to do so. And I guess one additional point, and just responding to Acosta's point that views have changed since this came out, that, the way we treat victims is different. Look, I was a prosecutor first in 2004. It has the case that prosecutors have been reluctant to believe the views of sex assault survivors, or that prosecutors have been afraid of bringing these cases forward. I think that it was a master class in defensiveness and in buck passing, but that's just not the way it works, and he should have known better than to make a comment like that.
Well, so, Caddy, what we're finding as we peel back this sorry story, we're finding that not only Acosta and the U.S. Attorney's Office failed, you also, of course, heard Elliot's criticism of what happened in Palm Beach. You also now are getting reports out of New York that the DA's office in New York did not check did not make Epstein check in regularly, that the New York City police did not make him check in regularly. We've heard that the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office would allow him to go from his halfway house being picked up by his valet. Everybody was allowing this guy to get away with raping little girls, slapping him on the wrist, and doing everything they could to play nice with Jeffrey Epstein. And the question that hovers above all of these jurisdictions and all of these decisions is why?
It's an incredibly painful story from the point of view of the victims, and the only legitimate apology that Alex Acosta could possibly have made yesterday would be, the honest one would be to say, I let a wealthy, powerful person get the better of a justice system. We are not all equal in the eyes of the law. This case suggests if you're Jeffrey Epstein and you have clout and you can use your money and your power because you have potentially political influence as well, then you can get away with this kind of thing. That was the only apology. It was not a question of Alex Acosta being able to say, I did the best possible job I did, or back in 2008 things are different. 2008 here. We're not talking about the 1960s. This is 2008, and it's not the case, as Elliot was just saying, that prosecutors didn't take into account victim trauma, or didn't take into account the fact that stories might change, or that victim shaming was allowed. This is not very long ago, and yet what this is simply is a case of somebody who was rich and powerful being able to get away with abhorrent behavior because he could use his political clout.
So, Joe, as we button this up and go to break, I just have to ask, as we look at this entire conversation we just had, how possible is it that this is just a miserable job done by Alex Acosta, that he was just bad at his job? How possible is it that just Jeffrey Epstein raped young girls in this grand scheme? How possible is it that this wasn't some scheme that involved a lot of powerful men who wanted to cover for themselves and had some sort of deal going with Alex Acosta? And that is why I wonder how there could be no legal ramifications for those in charge here, for those who were in charge of protecting the victims, and instead covered up for Jeffrey Epstein. But you gotta be kidding me that we're just talking about Jeffrey Epstein here. Does anyone disagree?
Well, first of all, that's why, one of the reasons why the Southern District's investigation of New York's investigation into these charges is going to be so important, because we're going to find out there have been people who have accused others, and the Miami Herald has reported that. We know that Jeffrey Epstein had power that could scare off prosecutors, perhaps, because of money, powerful lawyers because of money. But also, you have to go back to this time period and see that he was closely connected with Trump. As we said, he and Trump would have parties by themselves at Mar-a-Lago, shut the whole place down, have parties by themselves, and bring in girls for themselves. If you don't think that didn't get around Palm Beach, everybody knew that he was connected with Trump, who was one of the most powerful forces in Palm Beach at the time, throwing around money. And then, of course, when you go to the state of New York, you have recently retired, the 42nd president of the United States, Bill Clinton, who flew around with him regularly. You also, of course, very powerful lawyers like Alan Dershowitz were connected with Jeffrey Epstein. Dershowitz was quoted saying that if you were in New York City, you had to know Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein and hang out with them because they were the epicenter of power. Those were Dershowitz's words. So with that as a backdrop, you got to ask the question, was it about money? Was it about the powerful lawyers? Or was it about the powerful people that Jeffrey Epstein always surrounded himself with?
Who needed
we
cover.
don't know, but we will find out, I think, after this investigation unfolds, exactly who was with him on his island in his Manhattan townhouse while some very bad things were going on.
Oh, and wait, Alex Acosta gets job as labor secretary interesting.